I was teaching online to 100 students in Singapore, where we met first. These were MBA students. One of the questions was, when does it start and when does it end? So we need to have a definition, and we can make it a very broad definition, but I'm going to be quite narrow and specific because that is what my own experience is about. And then we can take it from there. So as far as I'm concerned, the turnaround begins when a company is not insolvent, but it cannot meet its financial obligations as they fall due. So it is heading towards insolvency, and it has moved from the commercial lending side of the bank that finances it to the specialist lending, or the recovery lending, or the distressed lending. They have different names for this. In other words, you've gone from a situation where the bank stops wanting to lend you money, but wants its money back. So the corporate turnaround that I'm talking about is therefore by definition in crisis. It has got no money, or is about to run out of money. When does that period end? Well, logically, it also ends then when the bank, having restructured the financing with your corporation, then agrees that you are stable enough to go back to the commercial lending side of the bank. That normally comes some time after you've actually stabilized the situation financially, because the banks know that you can stabilize it once, but you can slump again. So I'm talking about that as my definition for now of turnaround, because that does not include corporate transformation, but we can come back to that if you want to later on.
Thank you, David. I think it just kind of like painted a picture. So we have a banker in our midst. So I would actually have Odiri Oginni. What in your experience is corporate turnaround, especially with all the clients that you've dealt with?
Thank you very much, Biodun, for inviting me, and good afternoon, everyone. So corporate turnaround, interesting. When I listened to David, in my mind, I'd assumed that, the word transformation, can be associated with turnaround. But listening to what David has said, I'm asking myself, so there is something called corporate turnaround, and then there is something called corporate transformation. So my own definition of corporate turnaround, based on my experience and based on what I've seen working with multiple companies, my background is basically finance. I've been a CFO for over 15 years, before I actually became a CEO. So I've dealt with a number of companies I've seen, and I've also unseen. I worked also in the audit firm. So when you audit companies who are at the verge of bankruptcy, there are a lot of things that you see. So I would define corporate turnaround as basically a recovery, a financial recovery of a company that has probably underperformed for a period of time. And then you are moving it from underperformance to a state of thriving, where it gets to a point where, like David said, you're able to now meet your obligation, or you are now able to generate revenue to sustain yourself, restore profitability, and also become competitive in the marketplace. So you're coming from a position where, you are kind of have been beaten financially as a company, to a state where you are emerging out of that phase towards a position where you are able to deal, with your customers, deal with your suppliers, build your integrity all over again, regain profitability, and then also become competitive, all over again. So that's my definition of corporate turnaround. And in terms of possible triggers, what could really trigger, even getting to that state where you are down and out, or almost, in quote, down and out? I would say one of the possible triggers for corporate turnaround is financial distress. And the truth is, like I said, I've been a CFO, everything is written in the numbers. The numbers can tell you the story of a company. A company can be going into insolvency, but may not get there. Probably, it has been in that state for about 3-5 years, but reading through that numbers, you will know that this company is heading towards that direction. So I'll say one of the possible trigger is financial distress. Your financial performance is deteriorating, revenue is not growing as it used to be, or probably you've been growing 15-20% year on year, and all of a sudden you find out that, yes, you are growing in terms of your revenue or profitability, but you're now growing at maybe 1% or 2%. Sometimes you can say, oh, but I am growing. But the truth is, you are probably just surviving, and so deteriorating financial performance. And one of the things I will also say, which is what I've seen multiple times, is, sometimes the source of your revenue can also be a possible trigger. So you are a manufacturing company, you're supposed to be producing and selling and making revenue from the sales of your product, but you realize that this major source of your revenue is from non-operational activities. Probably you have some cash flow and you are generating interest income on it, or, things like that, or revaluation gain as a result of, certain policies and, things like that. But this major source of your revenue is largely from non-operational activity. So for me, that's a possible trigger, because if that continues over the years, you realize that it means that you're not producing or producing enough, and you're not generating sustainable revenue out of what you're really producing. And then maybe your debt profile is increasing. You're having cash flow challenges. So financial distress really is one of the major trigger for corporate turnaround. And then beyond financial distress, you can look at market activities. Probably your product are no longer as attractive to your customers as they used to be. Competitors are coming in and people are now shifting, their preference to other suppliers, or even maybe technology has come into your marketplace and probably disrupting, what you're currently doing. And, but these are internal stuff. I also realize that, external activities can also be a possible trigger. Today we talk about the world being a global village. We have the Russian-Ukraine crisis. A number of companies were largely affected by that activity. So those are external shocks that can also trigger corporate turnaround. COVID, a lot of companies are yet to recover from COVID. So COVID is not within your control. We all didn't see it, but that was an external shock that could have affected a number of companies and put them in a point where, they are now struggling to survive, and probably regulatory activities and regulatory inducements. So those are, in my opinion, possible triggers, for a company going insolvent and seeking to be turned around. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What an elaborate explanation from Odiri. Thank you. Now we're going to move to Sid, because he also have very extensive experience in this regard. And I want to invite Sid to share his views. What is corporate turnaround in your view, and how does it start? Let's leave the ending to later.
So I guess topping the explanations that were given by David and Odiri are going to be quite a challenge to begin with. But I kind of echo what they say. Effectively, corporate turnaround will begin from a cash perspective. So the minute you're sitting in a situation where working capital is not efficient, internal accruals of cash are not working, lenders are not willing to give you money, you're now putting yourself in an emergency stage. So effectively, when I think of corporate finance in a corporate turnaround, it's basically 3 stages that they operate within. First, you have the emergency stage, then you have stabilization, and then finally the return to growth. The emergency stage is where all of the financial discipline kind of kicks in, where you need to find your cash pockets. So where can I improve my cash cycle? Where can I improve my accounts receivable? Where can I elongate my EP? And that's more the financial discipline up front to make sure you can kind of set a path for recovery. But when you start hitting in a more stabilized stage, that's where you kind of go back and you try to see, okay, where did I go wrong with the supplier, or where did I go wrong in my financing activities for my products? Effectively, corporate turnaround will involve driving better cost efficiency for the company, but it also means a large part of it non-financially means you have to know your product, you have to know your customer, and you have to know your competition. Having done this in a country like India, demand is something that's driven by population. But having done it in a healthcare space, that is an entirely different spectrum, because now you're talking about equipment and how all of the other stuff from the cost of the equipment down to installation and all that works. You have regulatory aspects that also you have to look at. But I think corporate turnaround, as Odiri and David both said, is very different than transformation. But the strategies you have to employ to do a successful corporate turnaround are very different than the strategies you're doing to do a business transformation. I think overall, corporate turnaround will be mostly a financial trigger. The inputs of that financial trigger come from operations, but you can see it in the numbers. So for all of the finance folks sitting in the room, you'll always be able to identify the early warning signs if you do the right level of analysis and data management.
Thank you so much for that. I think that gives a solid foundation for the conversation we're going to have today. So deteriorating performance is something that we need to be very, very aware of. And for every organization, you know what performance is to you. And then if you're generating revenue or you're generating cash from non-operating activity, that might also be another thing to watch out for, because that means your operating activity is really suffering. And the earlier you put that into perspective, the better. And yes, I also hear about a lot that has to do with cost, internal issues, external issues. So I want to dive in a little bit more on that aspect. Yes, we know that COVID hit and everybody was taken by surprise, but then that shouldn't be the end of businesses. So how can organizations be proactive? Proactive in the sense that when issues beyond their control arise, then there has to be a response. So, there's this popular saying that says, when the going gets tough, then the tough gets going. So how can organizations build resilience into the business such that when shocks happen, especially external shocks, they're still able to survive and continue to do business? So that's what we want to explore next. So David, can you shed some light on that? Have you experienced a scenario where external shock happened, and was it a dead end, or was there something that could be done to salvage the situation?
Yeah, as I think that you've been hearing, there are internal reasons why a business gets into difficulty and external reasons. And I think that we need to address both of those things. I think that if external reasons will come along and destabilize a business, but if it's weak in the first place, it's going to have a much more difficult recovery opportunity. And as Odiri said, and I think Sid said too, it's all about cash and the shortage of cash. Oh dear. I've lost the screen. Have you all lost? Can you hear me or not?
Yes,
yes,
we can
I can hear you.
I don't know why I've lost the screen. I'll try and get it back in a minute. Fundamentally, for a business to survive external shocks, it has to have resilience, it was your word, and it has to have flexibility. And the question is, how do you actually create resilience and flexibility in a company? And that is not just about organizational structure. It might be about organizational structure. You might have more flexibility with a flat hierarchy than if you have a very layered hierarchy. But it's also a frame of mind. It's also about having a culture where people in the business not only accept change, but they embrace it and they even go looking for it. So you will never be able to respond to external shocks if you are so set in your ways that you're unable to respond to change in the environment. Now, I'm going to leave it at that because I think we should try to keep it short. So that's my first response. You need to have a flexible organization. And for that, chief executives and managers on this call, you yourselves have to have a flexible frame of mind. Do you do that? I stop there.
Okay. Wow. Flexibility. That's really spot on. And I think you mentioned something about your ability to respond to external trend is dependent on the internal structure. So Odiri, I'm going to